Good morning everybody and welcome to another video. Now normally you'll find me, a lot of the time anyway, out with my wildlife photography lens. Out and about getting pictures of foxes, badgers, stoats, weasels, birds. I also do a lot of macro photography, and it's really coming up to that time when it's a good period of time to do macro photography. And I always like macro photography because for me it's a bit of a leveler in the fact that, if you're not the sort of person who can get out and carry a massive lens around with you for hours and hours plonking through the countryside, which is one of the things with wildlife photography. Some of the time that is what you're going to be doing. Obviously there are other ways of doing it, but one of the main ones is a lot of legwork and a lot of carrying heavy kit around. If you're less mobile or if you're older and you want to do some photography that is really intricate and can be exceptionally beautiful, a lot of the time you can do it without leaving your back garden. Macro photography is that photography, absolutely. I've spent days in a 10-metre square area and not found all the things in that area to take a photograph of. That's how interesting and intricate it can be. So this week what I thought I'd do with that period of time, and I think the main macro period for me is sort of June, July, August. Everything else tends to go a little bit quiet. The birds have had a breeding season and a lot of them are looking a little bit shabby because they're going through a molt. So it's an ideal time really to break out the macro lens. So yeah, I thought it'd be interesting to just show you the basic setup for doing macro photography. In this video I won't go into things like macro flash photography, focus stacking. I'll probably do that in an additional video for those of you that want to take it a little bit further. But for those that you say have got a camera and you'd like to do a different type of photography, thinking about macro photography, this might be the way to go. Now this I'm using today is quite an expensive setup because obviously it's an A7r3 Sony camera with the Sony 90mm macro lens attached. I did do a video and I'll put a link up here to that for the Samyang, I think it's 100mm macro. Absolutely fantastic lens for macro photography. There is a reason why I've swapped it, and it's nothing to do with its macro capability. When I buy a lens I like to, if I can, make it multifunctional, and I bought that one to do a little bit of astrophotography with as well. And to cut a long story short, it doesn't focus past infinity, which I find essential for getting the stars sharp when I'm doing astrophotography. So, for that reason alone, I basically traded it in and went for this lens, which I think I'll do a better job in that area as well as the macro photography. But if you want to, if you want to just get into macro photography, then there are some cheaper options out there. Anyway, let's crack on. So what do you need to start out in macro photography? Well, obviously a camera and a lens. There are some, and I'll mention this now, there are some tricks to get around doing macro photography with a standard lens. So there are ways that you can get an adapter and invert a lens and use it the opposite way around to get a macro capability. There are also filters that you can put over the end of your lens that are basically magnifying the image that you're getting. I'm not going to go into that. If you want to have a try at that, there are videos on YouTube to show you how to do that. Specifically what I'm interested in is using a dedicated macro lens, although these techniques are also the same if you're using a zoom lens that's got a macro capability. The only issue with that is you won't be able to get a true one-to-one image. But other than that, the techniques are the same. So what do you need? You need a camera, you need a lens. Now, macro lenses, obviously different companies do different macro lenses. As I've said before earlier, the Samyang lens that I've used, I've been very happy with it in the past. That's a manual focus lens, there's no autofocus to it. And before you all start panicking, saying, oh, I can't do it without autofocus, I've, for many, many years, managed without autofocus. A lot of the time, the autofocus for me is not delicate enough on your lens to be able to focus in as precisely as you need to on that subject, in that area on that subject that you want to be in focus. And we'll get into stuff about that a little bit later, but don't worry if you find a lens that is a lot cheaper than this. I mean, I think this runs Used, I think I paid nearly £700 for this lens, so it's not cheap. The Samyang I think I got for under 200, so basically does the same job. Actually gives you a little bit more working distance as well, because it's I think that's a 100mm macro rather than this, which is a 90. But yeah, don't get too, uptight about not having autofocus. It's not really a massive issue for this type of photography, I've found anyway. So you've got your camera, you've got your lens. The first thing to do is to consider when you're going to go out and do macro photography. I've already mentioned the times of the year, but there's macro subjects around at all times of the year, and if you absolutely love macro photography, you can definitely do it 12 months of the year. There's always something that you can do in macro photography, whether you're doing abstract images or sort of art type images. There's always a subject for macro photography, and generally not far from your back door. But what I would say, if you're doing it in summer or any time of the year, and if you're doing sort of bugs and beetles and butterflies and dragonflies, what I tend to look for is nice still days. So I don't want any wind, because that just complicates matters and makes it so terribly more difficult. If you're trying to photograph something on a plant and the plant's waving in the wind and you're trying to get it in focus at the same time, it just makes it so much more difficult. I tend to look for still days. Today is a decent day because there's not much wind, especially where I am here, but I also like slightly overcast days, and what I mean by that is I like bright sunshine, but if there's a thin veil of cloud over the sun, it acts like a really big softbox and it gets rid of a lot of the harsh shadows, which again, if you're taking a picture of a butterfly on a plant and there's a blade of grass coming up at the side of it and that blade of grass is casting a harsh shadow across the butterfly, it just takes away from the image. So again, if you've got no direct sun, then that can remove those, but you do really need a bright day, and we'll get into that in a minute. One thing to realise when you first start doing macro photography is the fact that you're going to be working with a very shallow depth of field. Now, what does that mean? For those of you that have probably done a bit of landscape photography, you'll know that, if you shoot a landscape, a wide open vista at f2.8, some of the image will be in focus, but there'll be the mountains in the background. If you're focusing on a church in front, the mountains in the background will be out of focus, and perhaps the rocks underneath where the camera is, those your foreground interests, they'll be out of focus as well. So what do? You stop down to f11 or f16, and then that gets front to back focus. So it's a similar thing with macro photography, but your margins are so much smaller. So for instance, this lens at f2.8 wide open will probably be a millimetre that's the bit that's in focus. Now, if you're focusing on an ant, that might be most of the ant that's in focus, but if you're doing a dragonfly, for instance, it won't all be in focus. So what can you do to get around that? Well, the obvious answer is the same as you do for landscape photography. You close down the aperture. So you might go to f8 or f11 or f16, and you'll find that the depth of field grows. Again, it's minor though, that you're not going to get yards and yards. It'll be millimetres at a time that come into focus. Now, with today's modern cameras, if you've got things like focus peaking, that'll give you an idea of what's going to be in focus. But it's only with practicing with your setup that you'll find, what is going to be in focus. And again, if you're shutting down the aperture, if you're making a smaller and smaller aperture, which is where your light comes into the camera, or one of the ways, other things are going to suffer. So you might be shooting at a higher ISO, or you might be having to shoot at a slower shutter speed. And again, if you're shooting a creature that's moving, again, you can't do that too much, because if you go too low, then you're going to get a blurred image because the creature's moving. So it's a balance between all of them. And as I say, that's why I like to shoot on really bright days, because it gives me more light. Without using flash or anything else, that's your method. That's the 3 ways of getting light into the camera. And I suppose, today, ISO is the thing that you can lean on a little bit more, because a lot of the cameras handle that so much better. And with raw processing, with things like DxO, that improves it further, that you can put an image which is quite noisy, put it through some software, and it actually makes it a very good image. But as I say, this video, I'm not going to get into using flash. I'm not going to get into things like focus stacking. I'll do that in another video and I'll take you through that. Here it's just getting out and getting started with your new macro lens, and as I say, just experiment with different creatures. Start with something a little bit bigger, start with flowers, start with things that aren't racing around too much, and work out, you know, what depth of field you need. If it's something that's not moving like a flower, you can take multiple images at multiple apertures. You're not really, if it's a nice still day, you're not going to have a massively fast shutter speed. So again, that's the sort of thing to practice on to get you used to that. And then as you get used to that, you can move on to more tricky subjects. Right, I think I've already spoken a little bit about the camera settings, and for all types of photography, obviously, there's the three main ones. There's aperture, there's shutter speed, and then there's ISO. So you're really going to be fiddling about with those depending on your subject to get the best one for what you're photographing. And as I said to you earlier, you know, if you start on simpler subjects, things that aren't moving, that is a much easier job. For plants, for instance, you can set up on a tripod, you can spend as much time as you want, you can vary the aperture, you can vary the shutter speed, you can vary the ISO, you can move all those around to your heart's content to get the best combination that you want. As I say, you may want a shallow depth of field, particularly a lot of flowers look really good if you're just focusing on one point and then you've got the blurred lines of the petals leading you into that point. That often looks really nice, and it's a really arty image that a lot of people like to do. So you don't really have to have everything in focus if you're doing that sort of image. It works for animals as well. You know, you might want to just focus on the eyes and leave everything else slightly out of focus and blurred with a nice smooth background. So what about focusing? When you're working with a very shallow depth of field, it's always going to be quite difficult to get the bit in focus that you want in focus. There's a number of methods, and if you're shooting something that's a little bit bigger, so say you've got a zoom lens and you're not shooting 1:1, and you've got autofocus on that lens, often it's quite easy to autofocus on that subject. When you get down to using sort of 1:1 and true macro lenses, it can be quite difficult. However, if you're on a tripod and taking images of a static object like a plant, then you can use autofocus. I would recommend always, though, going into manual focus, and the reason for that is I think when you get to sort of 1:1 images, sometimes autofocus is not quite as accurate, and it can't, especially if you want to focus on, say you've got a flower head with a beetle on it, you might be pointing the autofocus at the flower head with the beetle on it, but the autofocus may focus on the flower head and not the beetle. And when you're dealing with such small depths of field, it could mean that the flower's in focus, but the beetle's out of focus. So I always recommend that you go to manual focusing. Now there's a couple of ways of doing that, and there's a couple of ways I've tried. I'll show you the way I don't use first, and that's basically just put your camera in manual focus. And this actual lens is quite good because it's just got a ring to switch between manual and autofocus. So if I pull it towards me, it's now in manual focus. Focus on the thing that you want, turn it until that bit's in focus. Now if you're using a Sony, this has obviously got focus peaking, so what will happen is you turn the manual focus ring, you'll see in my case I've got it set up to red. A red line will move through the image, and that's telling me the bit that's in focus. Now this is the method I don't use, because sometimes I find that, especially if I'm taking a picture of like bugs or butterflies, they might be moving across the head of a flower and I can't keep up focusing as quickly as they're moving. So it does work, you know, with certain things, and it's one that you can give a try, and then you just get the bit in focus that you want and take the image. The method I use, now what I'll tend to do, especially with things like if I've got a plant that's attracting loads and loads of butterflies, what I'll often do is, rather than chase a butterfly around, I'll pick the flower head that I want. And the reason I'll pick that flower head is, might be, if you see in this instance here, this flower head here, although it's quite nice, it's got this stem behind it. So if I take a picture of a butterfly on here, the chances are it's going to have a bigger line, although blurred, coming out the back. This flower head here at the top has got nothing for 2 meters behind it, so it's going to give me a lovely out of focus background. So what I would generally do is I will pre-focus on that area there, and then I'll just wait. Now when a butterfly lands on that, I won't touch the focus ring. I'll just move myself forward and back until that red line comes onto the butterfly, and then I'll take the shot, because we're talking millimeters, so it's a very, very small movement. But as you see, that's already set up, and it's, for me, that's much easier. I'm not touching the focus at all. I'm just using my body weight just to move slightly. You almost have to stop breathing. And that works for me really, really well, and that solves the focusing issue. And again, what you're going to have to do, and what I could do beforehand, is look at my settings to see, right, I know what butterfly I'm taking a picture of, that's how big it is, I know where it's going to land on there. I can then take shots beforehand to see what my depth of field is looking like. Maybe practice on some other butterflies, on ones that I'm not interested in taking because the background's not as nice, but just to get things like the depth of field right, and then, you know, shoot away. Now you can shoot in single shot mode, which is the camera's in here, because I don't really want to be taking loads of shots because I'm just demonstrating to you. But what I may do, if I'm doing it to get images of a certain butterfly or whatever, I may have it on continuous shooting, high speed, because the butterfly can move that little bit, the wing can be, just like with any type of wildlife photography, it can be in a slightly better position. The focus can change slightly if there's a little bit of a breeze or if the butterfly moves. So by doing that and say taking 6 or 7, 10 shots in a couple of seconds, there's a good chance that one of those is going to be the standout shot that I want to keep. If I'm just taking one shot, it may not be the one. I don't really want to keep pressing the button. I just want to fire away. As I say, there's no cost to you like if you were shooting with film in the past. You can just shoot away, take as many as you want, and if you only get one shot, and that's the shot at the end that, you know, goes on your wall, then does it really matter? You can delete all the others. So here's a couple of quick and easy tips that will help you when you're out in the field. Number one, be aware of your shadow. So I can guarantee that if you see a butterfly and you're approaching it and your shadow falls across it before you get to it, the butterfly will fly away. 99 times out of 100. A lot of creatures, a lot of small bugs do not like that sudden change, and they'll fly away, especially butterflies. So if you're going to approach it, try and keep your approach slightly to one side so that your shadow doesn't fall over it. The other thing I'd like to say, again, thinking about ethical photography, is always try and leave it so nobody knows that you've been there doing macro photography. So yeah, your ground sheet might level a little bit of grass or something, but if you're trying to take an image, say, of a plant, it's quite all right to move stuff out of the way. So maybe just put a little bit of a branch, a little bit of a twig on it to slightly move it out of the way. Try not to break anything so that when you've gone, it can all spring back up and be as you left it, really. You don't really want to be pulling plants up, and, you know, you'd never find me doing that. That's not something that I would do. I'm quite happy to just bend stuff to one side, but generally speaking, what I want to do is leave it as if I've not been there at all. And by doing that, you won't go far wrong, and you won't incur the wrath of any landowners or wildlife trusts either. Right, I hope you've enjoyed this week's video, this short introduction to macro photography. There are a lot more techniques involved with macro photography, but this will get you out there and get you started, and hopefully stop you getting frustrated, which you can do if you're not getting the results that you think you should be doing. There's just a few little tips in there that hopefully will get you over that. Once we get on to the more complicated stuff, so as I said earlier in the video, you can use flash, you can use focus stacking, and there are a couple of methods, as I also said, where you don't have to have a macro lens. You can get macro filters that increase the size of the subject. This video hasn't gone into that, but again, if you want to have a little try, you can probably get those quite inexpensively. But for me, if you get a dedicated macro lens, hopefully the tips in here have helped you, and you'll be able to move your photography forward. I think it's a fantastic way of doing some wildlife photography. And you can do this in your own back garden and probably not have to move from there for a very long time. By changing the plants, by putting things like ponds in, you'll bring the wildlife in, all the small stuff, the dragonflies, the butterflies, the moths as well. You may have seen my videos on moth trapping. I'll put a link to that up here. That's something else you can do from your back garden and get a massive variety of creatures that you can photograph. Anyway, that's it for this video. I'll see you next week for another one. Please give this one a thumbs up, and if you've not subscribed to the channel, then please subscribe to the channel. It really does help the channel grow. I'm not sure what I'm doing next week. I am still doing macro photography. I'll be here now for a couple of hours before it gets too hot and the bugs get too active, and I'll put those images up at the end of this video. So that'll be all taken with this 90mm macro Sony lens. They'll be the first images I've taken with it, so it'll be a bit of a surprise to me how they come out. I'll see you next week for another video. Bye.